The microphone feedback whined like a stepped-on cat before Bradley cleared his throat. I was already nursing a watery scotch, bracing for the usual Groom platitudes. Instead, he delivered a punchline about my dead wife. 10 minutes later, I pocketed the family rings and dialed 911. The reception hall smelled of roasting meat, dying lilies, and that sharp, metallic undertone of nervous sweat. It was one of those aggressively rustic converted barns that cost a small fortune to rent, drafty in the winter and a greenhouse in July. Today, it was July. The air conditioning was losing a brutal battle against the body heat of 200 guests. I sat at the corner of the head table, running my thumb over the condensation beading on my glass of scotch. The ice had long since surrendered, leaving the amber liquid tepid and diluted. I watched my daughter, Chloe. She looked beautiful, wrapped in layers of white tulle that hissed against the wooden floorboards every time she shifted. But there was a tightness around her eyes, a frantic bird-like energy as she scanned the room, desperately mentally tallying whether everyone was having the time of their lives. She had been doing that since she was 14, since her mother died. Sarah's absence wasn't a ghost. It was a physical weight at the table. It was the empty chair I had successfully fought the wedding planner to keep beside me. "It ruins the symmetry, Arthur," the planner had whispered 3 weeks ago, tapping her clipboard. I had just looked at her until she backed down. Sarah loved symmetry, but she hated being left out more. Beside Chloe sat Bradley, the groom. Bradley wore a midnight blue tuxedo that fit a little too snugly across his chest, the fabric pulling at the solitary button. He leaned back in his chair, one arm draped heavily over Chloe's shoulders, the other clutching a half-empty bottle of imported lager. He smelled of heavy, woodsy cologne, the kind that gets trapped in the back of your throat, and something inherently arrogant. I never liked him. I tried. Lord knows I tried, for Chloe's sake. But Bradley was a man who lived his life in loud, aggressive broadcasts. Every conversation was a competition. Every silence was an opportunity for him to insert a joke that usually came at someone else's expense. My right hand drifted to my breast pocket, pressing against the stiff fabric of my suit jacket. The suit was older, tailored for a version of me that carried 20 more pounds of happy weight. The grief diet had hollowed me out, leaving the shoulders slightly hollow, the collar a fraction too loose. Inside that pocket was a folded piece of paper, an insurance addendum. The rings on Chloe and Bradley's fingers weren't from a mall jeweler. They were Sarah's grandparents' rings, 2 thick bands of vintage platinum, cast in the 1920s, inset with rough-cut, unpolished diamonds. Sarah had worn her grandmother's. I had worn her grandfather's until the arthritis in my knuckles made it impossible. When Chloe announced her engagement, she came to me, eyes shining, asking if they could use them. I hesitated, not because of Chloe, but because of the man she was attaching to that platinum. Bradley had scoffed when he saw them. "A little dull, aren't they? Kinda looks like stainless steel," he had said, tossing the heavy band in his palm like a cheap coin. I had agreed to let them use the rings for the ceremony on one strict condition. They remained my legal property until I officially gifted them. I drew up a standard loan agreement under the guise of a rigid insurance policy I claimed my broker required. Chloe signed it without reading. Bradley rolled his eyes, mocked my boomer paranoia, and scribbled his name. At the time, it felt like a petty, cynical move, an old man clinging to control, sitting in the sweltering barn, listening to the clatter of silverware against china. I realized it wasn't paranoia. It was instinct. The waiters began clearing the plates, the scraping of porcelain drowning out the low hum of conversation. The groomsmen, a collection of 5 identically styled men with flushed faces and loosened ties, were already on their 4th round of tequila shots. They laughed at something Bradley said, a harsh, braying sound that cut through the room. Chloe smiled, but her hand was gripping the edge of the table. Her knuckles were white. The tulle of her dress rustled against the floor. The best man, a guy named Todd who looked like he sweated pure energy drink, tapped his fork against a champagne flute. The sharp clink, clink, clink signaled the beginning of the end, the speeches. I took a slow sip of my watered-down scotch. It tasted like ash, and melted ice. I just had to get through the next 30 minutes. I just had to smile, nod, and go back to my empty house, leaving my daughter to the life she had chosen. Todd's speech was exactly what you'd expect. 10 minutes of rambling anecdotes about college blackouts, vague allusions to property damage, and a deeply uncomfortable story about a trip to Cabo that made Chloe stare resolutely at her lap. By the time he finished, half the room was checking their watches, and the older relatives were wearing expressions of polite, frozen horror. Then, Bradley stood up. He didn't just stand, he claimed the space. He unbuttoned his jacket, adjusted his cuffs, and took the microphone from Todd with the swagger of a stand-up comic walking onto a late-night stage. He tapped the mic twice. The feedback shrieked, slicing through the humid air. Test. Test. We good? Bradley grinned, showing a lot of very white, very expensive teeth. He looked out over the crowd, letting the silence stretch. He wanted all the eyes. He needed them. First off, he started, his voice booming out of the rented PA system, heavily bass-boosted. I want to thank you all for coming out, especially those of you who survived Todd's speech. Give it up for Todd, everyone. Barely literate, but he tries. A ripple of laughter. Bradley fed on it. His shoulders dropped. His chest puffed out further. They say a wedding is the bride's day, Bradley continued, turning to look down at Chloe. She offered him a bright, fragile smile, and looking at Chloe, yeah, I definitely married up. I mean, look at me. I'm a solid 7 on a good day, and she's a 10. I secured the bag, boys. He pointed a finger gun at his groomsmen. They howled. The heavy scent of roasted beef and stale beer seemed to thicken in my nose. I kept my face blank, my eyes fixed on the salt shaker in front of me. Bradley paced a few steps to the left, the microphone cord trailing behind him. But seriously, marriage, it's a big step. Everyone gives you advice. The guys at the office, the guys at the gym. Mostly, they just warn you. They tell you about the lack of freedom. They tell you about the honey-do lists. He paused, adopting a mock-serious tone. And, of course, they warn you about the mother-in-law. The air in my lungs stopped moving. I didn't shift in my chair, I didn't look up, but my peripheral vision sharpened into high definition. I could see the grain of the wood on the table. I could see the tiny, erratic pulse at the base of Chloe's throat. Bradley chuckled, a low, breathy sound amplified by the mic. Yeah, the legendary monster-in-law, the one who comes to your house, reorganizes your kitchen, tells you your TV is too big, and complains that you don't make enough money. He stopped pacing. He turned his body slightly, angling himself toward my end of the table. I was bracing for it. I really was. I bought the earplugs. I practiced my yes ma'am in the mirror. Bradley grinned. He looked directly at me. But honestly, I gotta send a huge thank you to Arthur's late wife, Sarah. A few people inhaled sharply. A quiet, collective gasp from the tables closest to the front. Bradley didn't notice. Or if he did, he didn't care. He was on a roll. Yeah, Sarah took the early exit about 3 years ago. I never got to meet her, but I gotta say she really took one for the team. Saved me a fortune in Mother's Day flowers, and I never have to hear her nag me about my Sunday golf habit. Cheers to Sarah, everyone. The best kind of mother-in-law is a quiet one. He raised his beer bottle in my direction. Silence. It wasn't just a quiet room. It was a vacuum. The kind of absolute, crushing stillness that follows a car crash right before the screaming starts. Somewhere in the back, a waiter dropped a metal tray. The clatter sounded like a gunshot, but nobody flinched. The guests were frozen, forks suspended halfway to mouths, wine glasses hovering in midair. I looked at Chloe. Her face had drained of all color, leaving her makeup looking like a mask painted on a corpse. Her mouth was slightly open, her eyes wide, darting from Bradley to me and back again. She let out a tiny, high-pitched sound. It was meant to be a chuckle to break the tension, but it sounded like a whimper. Bradley's grin faltered, just at the edges. He lowered his bottle, realizing the laugh track he expected hadn't played. Tough crowd. He muttered into the mic, tapping it again. Come on, it's a joke. Lighten up. I didn't feel a surge of hot rage. I didn't see red. If anything, the temperature in my blood plummeted. Everything became incredibly cold, incredibly clear. I smelled vanilla and old paper. Sarah's smell. It cut right through the cologne and the stale beer. I remembered her holding Chloe as a baby, rocking her in the dark. I remembered the way her laugh used to fill the kitchen, a loud, genuine sound that bounced off the tiles. And I remembered the sound of her breathing in the hospice bed, the ragged, wet drag of air that I listened to for 3 straight days, praying for it to continue, terrified for it to stop. The early exit. I placed my hands flat on the table. The linen was rough against my palms. I pushed my chair back. The wooden legs scraped against the floorboards. In the absolute silence of the room, it sounded like a scream. I stood up. My knees popped a dry, brittle sound. I buttoned my jacket. One button. Slow, deliberate. Every eye in the room was pinned to me. I could feel the collective anxiety radiating off the guests. A palpable wave of heat. The older relatives from Sarah's side were staring at me with a mix of horror and expectation. The groomsmen had stopped sweating and started looking at the floor. I walked around the back of my chair. My heavy leather shoes thudded softly against the wood. I didn't rush. I walked the length of the head table, passing the empty chair I had fought so hard to keep. I traced my fingers lightly over the top of its curved wooden back as I passed. Bradley stood his ground, but his posture shifted. The arrogant slouch vanished. He straightened up, planting his feet a little wider, puffing his chest out. The microphone dangled loosely from his left hand. "Arthur," Bradley said, his voice dropping an octave, trying to sound authoritative but coming off defensive. He didn't use the mic, but the room was so quiet his voice carried perfectly. "Look, man, it was just a joke. Don't make a scene." I stopped about 3 feet from him. Up close, the flaws in his confidence were glaring. A bead of sweat was tracking down his temple, cutting a pale line through his bronzer. The pulse in his neck was hammering against his tight collar. "A scene," I repeated. My voice sounded strange to my own ears. Flat, stripped of any inflection. Chloe stood up so fast her chair tipped backward, crashing to the floor. "Dad, Dad, please." She reached out, her fingers wrapping around my forearm. Her hands were ice cold. "He didn't mean it. He's just nervous. He's drinking. Please, Dad, don't ruin today." I looked down at my daughter, the little girl who used to hide behind my legs when thunder shook the house, the woman who was now begging me to swallow an unforgivable insult to her dead mother just to keep the peace. "I'm not ruining today, Chloe," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, meant only for her. "I'm just fixing a mistake." I gently but firmly peeled her fingers off my sleeve. I didn't let go of her hand. Instead, I ran my thumb over the thick platinum band, sitting above her new diamond engagement ring. "Sarah's grandmother's ring. Take it off," I said. Chloe blinked, the words not computing. "What?" "Take the ring off, Chloe." Bradley stepped forward, inserting himself between us. He bumped my shoulder, hard enough to be aggressive, but not quite a strike. "Whoa, whoa, back up, Arthur. What the hell do you think you're doing?" I didn't look at him. I kept my eyes on Chloe. "The ring. Now." "Are you insane?" Bradley hissed, his face flushing dark red. He dropped the microphone. It hit the floor with a loud thunk that made several people in the front row flinch. "You're embarrassing yourself. Go sit down." I finally turned my head to look at him. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "Bradley," I said, perfectly calm, "take off my grandfather's ring." "It's my ring," he spat, holding up his hand. The platinum caught the harsh overhead lighting. "We just got married. You gave it to us. I loaned it to you." I reached into my breast pocket and pulled out the folded sheet of paper. I held it up between 2 fingers. The paper trembled slightly, the only outward sign of the adrenaline flooding my system. "You signed a temporary loan agreement for insurance purposes. Ownership transfers only upon my explicit written consent, which you do not have and will never Get. Bradley stared at the paper. His jaw worked, grinding back and forth. He looked out at the crowd, realizing the audience he had cultivated was now witnessing his humiliation. His pride, fragile and inflated, shattered. "Screw you, old man," Bradley snarled. He took a step closer, towering over me by 3 inches. I could smell the stale lager on his breath, mixed with onions and bile. "I'm not giving you a damn thing. You're going to turn around, walk your miserable ass back to your seat, and let us enjoy our wedding. Because if you don't..." He didn't finish the threat. He just flexed his hands into fists. Todd, the best man, finally broke the paralysis. He stepped off the raised platform, approaching cautiously. "Hey guys, let's just take a breath, all right? Arthur, maybe we can talk about this out." "Stay exactly where you are, Todd," I said, not taking my eyes off Bradley. Todd stopped dead. "I will ask you one last time," I said to Bradley. The coldness inside me was crystallizing into something hard and sharp. "Return my property." "Make me," Bradley challenged, a nasty, triumphant smirk touching the corner of his mouth. He thought he had won. He thought the threat of physical violence, the threat of a public brawl at his daughter's wedding, would force me into submission. He thought I was just a sad old widower who would back down to avoid a scene. He didn't understand that when you've already watched the most important person in your world die, the social etiquette of a reception hall means absolutely nothing. I didn't argue. I didn't throw a punch. I simply reached into my left pocket and pulled out my phone. I unlocked the screen. The brightness glared in the dim room. I tapped the keypad. 3 numbers. Joe. E. I pressed the green call button and raised the phone to my ear. "Dad! No!" Chloe shrieked, finally breaking out of her stupor. She lunged forward, trying to bat the phone away, but I turned my body, shielding it. 911. "What is your emergency?" The dispatcher's voice bled through the earpiece, tinny and calm. "Yes," I said, my voice ringing out clearly in the silent barn. "My name is Arthur Pendleton. I am currently at the Willow Creek Event Center. I need police assistance." Bradley's smirk vanished. The color drained from his face, replaced by a sickly, mottled gray. "Are you out of your mind?" he whispered. "What is the nature of your emergency, sir?" the dispatcher asked. I looked dead into Bradley's panicked eyes. "I am reporting a theft in progress. The suspect is hostile, intoxicated, and refusing to return $40,000 worth of stolen heirloom jewelry." The dispatcher hung up, leaving a flat, dead tone in my ear. I lowered the phone and slipped it back into my pocket. The silence in the barn had mutated. It wasn't the shocked stillness from before. It was a living, breathing thing, heavy and suffocating. It was the sound of 200 people simultaneously realizing they were trapped in a hostage situation of social etiquette. I didn't sit back down. I just stood there, my hands resting on the back of my empty chair. I could smell the roast beef cooling on the plates, the fat congealing into white rims. The lilies in the centerpieces suddenly smelled overly sweet, like decay masking itself as perfume. Bradley was pacing. He took 3 steps to the left, spun around, took 3 steps to the right. The swagger was entirely gone, replaced by the frantic, jerky movements of a trapped animal. He ran a hand through his hair, destroying the expensive pomade hold, leaving strands sticking up at odd angles. "You're bluffing," he said. He pointed a finger at me, but his hand was shaking. "The cops aren't coming. They don't respond to domestic squabbles at a wedding." I didn't answer him. I just kept my eyes on his chest, on the pocket where he had tucked the microphone. Todd, the best man, backed away. It was a subtle movement, just a shifting of weight, a half step toward the exit, but it spoke volumes. The unified front of the groomsmen was dissolving. They were exchanging nervous, wide-eyed glances, suddenly very interested in the floorboards, their shoes, their cuticles. Nobody wanted to catch a charge for accessory to grand larceny at a wedding reception. Chloe finally moved. She walked toward me, the heavy tulle of her dress dragging across the floor with a sound like dry leaves. Her mascara had started to run, tiny black rivers cutting through the foundation on her cheeks. "Dad," she whispered. Her voice was cracked, shattered. She stopped 2 feet away from me. I could smell the sharp chemical tang of her hairspray mixed with the frantic sourness of her sweat. Please, call them back. Tell them it was a mistake. I looked at my daughter. My heart hammered a brutal, heavy rhythm against my ribs. A sickening wave of guilt washed over me, thick and nauseating. I was ruining her wedding day, the day she had dreamed about, planned for, stressed over for 14 months. I was the villain in the story she would tell for the rest of her life. Am I doing the right thing? The thought flickered in my mind, a brief moment of profound doubt. I looked at her pleading eyes, the way her bottom lip trembled. All I wanted to do was wrap my arms around her, tell her everything was fine, and make the bad feelings go away. That was my job. I was her father. But then my gaze shifted over her shoulder, landing on Bradley. He was glaring at me, his lip curled in a sneer of pure, unadulterated contempt. He wasn't looking at Chloe. He wasn't comforting his bride. He was watching me, trying to figure out how to win the power struggle. He had stood on a stage in front of our family and treated the death of the woman who birthed Chloe as a punchline. He celebrated the silence of the grave because it meant he didn't have to deal with a mother-in-law. The guilt evaporated. It crystallized into something cold, dense, and immovable. I can't do that, Chloe, I said gently. Do you hate me that much? She sobbed, the tears finally spilling over. Do you hate that I'm happy? Is that it? You've been miserable since Mom died, and you can't stand that I'm moving on. The words hit me like a physical blow. A dull ache bloomed in my chest. I don't hate you, sweetie. I love you more than anything in this world. I reached out, my thumb brushing a tear from her cheek. She didn't pull away, but she didn't lean into my touch either. But I will not let that man wear your grandfather's ring. Not after what he just said. It was a joke, she cried, her voice cracking loudly. It wasn't a joke, I replied, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. It was an introduction. That is who he is, Chloe. When people tell you who they are, believe them the first time. A murmur rippled through the crowd. I glanced toward the back of the room. Aunt Helen, Sarah's oldest sister, was standing up. She methodically folded her linen napkin, placed it on the table, picked up her purse, and walked toward the exit. She didn't say a word. She didn't look back. It was the crack in the dam. Within seconds, a dozen other guests from Sarah's side of the family were standing. The scraping of chairs echoed through the barn. They gathered their coats, their purses, their dignity, and began a silent, grim procession out the double wooden doors. "Hey!" Bradley yelled, his voice cracking with panic. "Hey, where are you going? The cake hasn't been cut. The band is starting in 10 minutes. Nobody answered him. The exodus continued. The room was draining of life, leaving behind half-empty plates and the sour smell of a dying party. "Look what you're doing!" Bradley screamed at me. He lunged forward, closing the distance between us. "You're ruining my wedding! You crazy old bastard! I should lay you out right here!" He raised a fist. I didn't flinch. I just looked at his knuckles. They were perfectly manicured. "Do it," I said. "Assaulting a senior citizen. That'll look great on the police report right next to the grand larceny." Chloe shoved herself between us, pushing her hands against Bradley's chest. "Stop it, Brad, stop. Just calm down." "Tell your lunatic father to call off the cops," he roared, spit flying from his lips, landing on Chloe's cheek. She flinched, her eyes widening. For the first time all night, she looked at him not as her groom, but as a threat. Before Bradley could shove past her, the interior of the barn was painted with a violent, rhythmic strobing light. Red, blue, red, blue. The heavy, sweeping beams sliced through the gaps in the rustic wooden siding, casting long, erratic shadows across the dance floor. The gravel in the parking lot crunched under the heavy tires of 2 squad cars. The murmuring in the room died completely. You could hear the hiss of the air conditioning vents, finally pushing out cold air now that half the bodies were gone. The heavy double doors at the front of the barn swung open. 2 police officers stepped inside. They brought the humid summer night air in with them. One was older, thick around the middle, carrying the weary posture of a man who was 2 hours past the end of his shift. The other was young, his uniform sharp, his hand resting casually, instinctively, near his utility belt. The radios on their shoulders squawked a burst of incomprehensible static that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. The older officer hooked his thumbs into his duty belt and scanned the room. His eyes swept over the fleeing guests, the abandoned tables, and finally settled on the head table. On me, standing perfectly still. On Bradley, looking like he was about to vomit. And on Chloe, weeping in her white dress. "Evening," the older cop said. His voice was calm, bored, utterly unimpressed by the tool and the tuxedos. "Dispatch got a call about a theft. Somebody want to tell me who called?" I raised my hand. "That was me, officer." The heavy thud of the officer's boots against the wooden floorboards echoed through the barn as they approached the head table. The remaining guests, mostly Bradley's friends and family, watched in stunned, morbid fascination. Nobody reached for their phones. It was too raw, too real for an Instagram story. The older officer stopped a few feet from me. He looked at my suit, then at Bradley's tuxedo. "You, Arthur Pendleton?" "Yes, sir." "You want to tell me what's going on here, Mr. Pendleton?" Dispatch said something about $40,000 in jewelry. I nodded. I reached into my breast pocket and pulled out the folded paper. I handed it to him. My late wife's grandparents' rings, vintage platinum, unpolished diamonds, appraised at roughly 22 grand for the groom's band, 18 for the brides. I loaned them to my daughter and her fiancé for the ceremony. The officer unfolded the paper, adjusting his posture to catch the dim lighting. Bradley couldn't take the silence. He stepped around Chloe, forcing a nervous, overly familiar laugh. "Hey, officer, look, this is all just a huge misunderstanding, a bad joke. It's my wedding day. My father-in-law here had a little too much scotch and got offended by a speech. You know how it is. Family drama." The older officer didn't look up from the paper. "I know how it is when I get called away from a noise complaint to deal with a felony theft in progress, son." He finished reading and looked at me. "This is a loan agreement, stating you retain ownership until written transfer." "Correct," I said, "which I have not provided. I asked him to return my property. He refused. He became aggressive." The younger officer shifted his weight, his eyes locking onto Bradley. "Sir, is that the ring on your left hand?" Bradley grabbed his left wrist with his right hand, a defensive, infantile gesture. "I'm the groom. We literally just got married an hour ago. He gave us the rings at the altar. You can't steal a gift." "It's not a gift if the paperwork says it's a loan," the older officer countered, his tone flat. He handed the paper back to me. He turned his full attention to Bradley. The sheer, exhausting reality of the law settled over the space. "Look, buddy, I don't care about your speeches. I don't care about your wedding cake. I care about the fact that this man holds the legal title to the jewelry on your hand. He has asked for it back, and you are refusing. In this state, anything over $1,000 is grand larceny. You're going to arrest me at my own wedding." Bradley's voice pitched up, breathless with disbelief. He looked around the room, seeking backup, but his groomsmen were staring intently at the ceiling beams. "I don't want to arrest anyone," the older officer sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I want to go home, eat a cold turkey sandwich, and go to sleep. So here is how this plays out. You take the ring off and hand it to Mr. Pendleton. Or I put you in handcuffs, put you in the back of my cruiser, and we let a judge figure out the paperwork on Monday morning. You'll spend your wedding night in holding. Your call." The silence returned. The only sound was the distant hum of the refrigerator in the catering kitchen. Bradley looked at the cops. He looked at the paperwork in my hand. Then he looked at me. The hatred in his eyes was visceral. It was a dark, oily thing. If we had been alone in an alley, he would have killed me. I saw it plain as day. But we weren't in an alley. We were in a room filled with witnesses and two armed men. Bradley's jaw clenched. The muscles in his neck jumped. With a jagged, furious motion, He grabbed the thick platinum band on his left ring finger. It caught on his knuckle. He yanked it hard, scraping the skin, pulling it free. He didn't hand it to me. He threw it. The heavy metal ring hit my chest, bounced off my lapel, and clattered onto the floorboards. It rolled in a slow, agonizing circle before settling near the toe of my shoe. "There," Bradley spat, his chest heaving. "Take your damn ring. You sad, pathetic old man. Keep it. You've got nothing else." I didn't react to the insult. I slowly bent down. My knees ached. I picked the ring up off the dusty floor. It felt cold. The metal was heavy, dense with history. I rubbed a smudge of dirt off the edge with my thumb and slid it into my right pocket. Then I looked at Chloe. She was standing frozen, her arms wrapped around her waist, holding herself together. She had watched the man she loved throw a tantrum, disrespect her father, and surrender to the police like a cornered coward. The illusion was gone. "Chloe," I said softly. She didn't speak. She slowly raised her left hand. The diamond engagement ring Bradley had bought her sparkled aggressively under the lights. Beneath it sat the slim, elegant platinum band that had belonged to her great-grandmother, the band her mother had worn for 32 years. She slid the engagement ring off first. She held it in her palm. Then she slid the platinum band off. She didn't throw it. She walked over to the table, right next to the empty chair meant for Sarah. She placed the platinum band gently on the white linen. She looked at me. Her eyes were completely hollow. There was no anger left, no sadness, just a vast, empty exhaustion. "You both ruined this," she whispered. Her voice was barely audible, but it carried the weight of a judge's gavel. "You both made me choose, and I hate you both for it." She didn't wait for my response. She turned around, grabbing fistfuls of her white tulle skirt to keep from tripping, and walked away. She didn't look at Bradley. She walked past the cops, pushed through the double doors, and disappeared into the hot summer night. Bradley stood there, stunned. He looked at the cops, then at the door, realizing he was a groom without a bride, wearing a rented tuxedo, standing in an empty hall. I picked up Sarah's ring from the table. I slipped it into my pocket, letting it clink against the other one. "Are we done here, Mr. Pendleton?" the older officer asked. "We're done," I said. I didn't look at Bradley again. I walked past the officers, the leather of my shoes heavy on the floorboards. When I pushed through the doors, the humidity hit me like a wet towel. The parking lot was half empty. Chloe was nowhere in sight. I assumed she had gotten into a friend's car. I walked to my sedan, parked under a dying oak tree near the edge of the gravel lot. I unlocked the door, climbed into the driver's seat, and shut the door. The sound insulated me from the world. I didn't start the engine right away. I sat in the dark. The smell of old leather and the faint, lingering scent of the vanilla air freshener Sarah had hung from the rearview mirror 3 years ago surrounded me. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the 2 rings. I held them in the palm of my hand. In the dim light of the dashboard, they didn't sparkle. They were just cold, heavy metal. I had protected Sarah's memory. I had stood my ground. I had refused to let a bully wear the symbol of my family's history. But as I sat there in the crushing silence of my car, alone, I realized the cost. Chloe's words echoed in my head. "You both ruined this." I squeezed my hand shut, the sharp edges of the uncut diamonds pressing into my skin, grounding me in the physical pain. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine rumbled to life, the headlights cutting a pale beam through the darkness. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the lot, leaving the flashing police lights behind me. I didn't feel like a hero. I didn't feel victorious. I just felt incredibly, unbearably tired. But as I merged onto the empty highway, I pressed my hand against my pocket, feeling the weight of the rings against my leg. It was a messy, brutal victory, but it was ours. If this story hit home, drop a like and share it with someone who understands that setting boundaries isn't always pretty, but it's always necessary. Grief and love demand respect, and sometimes you have to be the bad guy to protect the people you care about. Have you ever had to draw a hard line with family? Tell me in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more raw, real Stories every week.